Good morning and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here. And it is my joy to welcome you to the Forum on this Palm Sunday. As we contemplate the passion and death of Jesus, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Felicity Harley McGowan, who is a lecturer at Yale Divinity School, where she is a specialist in early Christian and medieval art. Before arriving at Yale, she was the Jerry Higgins Lecturer in Medieval Art History at the University of Melbourne in her native Australia. Dr. Harley McGowan, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Father Peter. Lovely to be here.
Great to have you here. And I think you're going to begin with a brief presentation and then we'll have questions afterwards. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. So I will just put my... Now, is the presentation up?
Yes, we can see it. Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Well, again, thank you. It's a delight to be with you, and a special delight at this time, for me at least, to gather on Palm Sunday, a time when we would usually be accustomed to having this sort of close proximity with each other in worship that we're not able to do at present. And as we begin to turn towards Holy Week and Good Friday, I wanted today to think with you a little about the cross and the events that took place on Golgotha, because of course these events become a very pointed focus for us. But in the early church, about which I want to speak with you today, there was a different kind of focus. And so I want to use today as a way of entering into imagining what their focus was like and how that might inform our own approach to the cross and our thoughts about the event on Good Friday. Let me begin then by asking you to imagine the scene of Jesus' death, because the representation of the crucifixion is one of the most central images in Christianity. We see so many representations that our mind is full of different visual images. I wonder if you were to close your eyes, what you would see, or if you were to draw what you saw, what the key components of your image might be. Historically, when Christians recall Jesus' death on the cross, there is a concern with two particular things. On the one hand, an historical event, so that is Jesus' death in time in a particular location. And there's also an abstract idea, that is man's redemption, what the meaning of the event is. So for art, this presents a fundamental tension, and one with which we still wrestle or negotiate in different ways today. And that is historical fact on the one hand, and the eschatological significance of the event on the other. How are these two things to be depicted? The image that I show you here was painted sometime in the late 5th or early 6th century on a sheet of vellum, alongside the resurrection, which I'll show you in a moment, as a page for inclusion in a gospel book. And here you can see the scale of the page and the book in which it has been included. So in this miniature, both the historical context is depicted and something of the meaning of the event. Maybe this image has resonance with some of the components of the image you imagined in your mind at the outset. So you will observe, for example, there's a lot of details here, but I'll just pick out a few. You'll observe the gold halo around Christ's head, which indicates his divinity. You see that he is very clearly nailed. He's also pierced in the side and he bleeds from those wounds. But at the same time, he's alive. His eyes are open as he inclines his head. The event is set into a landscape to evoke the setting of Golgotha, and the scene is filled with figures. The identity of these figures we recognize by virtue of the Passion narratives, which we read at this time in the liturgical season. And these, of course, record the events of what we will celebrate as Good Friday. The paint that this miniaturist has used gives colour to the geographical features, as well as to the clothing and to the structure of the cross. And so we have some animation in this scene, a sense of movement, of shading, and of depth, perhaps, in this landscape. And as a painted miniature in a gospel book, the scene is directly connected to the stories about Christ's life on earth. Now, I'm going to show you a second image from about the same time, perhaps from Egypt, a tiny engraved rock crystal that could be worn. You'll see it mounted here as a pendant to be suspended around the neck. In this case, the story is unmoored from its textual, but also its historical context. The scene of Jesus on his cross is now trimmed down, but it still remains recognizable. We have just two figures here present at the cross, and it's interesting, perhaps these are the two soldiers. There's some debate about who these figures are. Perhaps they evoke the two soldiers, but they are, their identity is open enough for perhaps we can project ourselves into these figures. That's a point perhaps we can discuss. But there we have them standing either side of the cross, just as we saw the soldier and the bystander with the sponge in the previous image. But there's only the bust of Christ, the shoulders and the head, that's shown positioned above the cross. No body. And we have, instead of a halo, a cross symbol behind Christ's head. Two stars, or perhaps the sun and the moon, appear either side of his head, as we saw in the previous image. And rather than green or brown to denote an earthly landscape, the medium here, as I mentioned, is rock crystal. It's two pieces of crystal with gold leaf sandwiched in between the two to bring out the particular details of the figures. So there's something otherworldly suggested here, I think. The cross and the two men certainly refer to Golgotha, but are we meant to imagine ourselves on Golgotha, or are we somewhere else? The stars suggest perhaps a celestial location. And indeed, if you look closely at the base of the cross, there are four rivers or four lines that run from the base. And these are the four rivers that are listed in the book of Genesis in association with the Garden of Eden, and so associated with paradise. And we can identify them because they appear in a variety of pictorial contexts at this period. So in effect, what we have here is Christ as the glorious, crucified and resurrected Son of God being adored in paradise. And of course, when the thief who recognizes Christ as they are hanging on their crosses on Golgotha, Christ promises that the thief will too enter paradise. There is a further step here in clarifying the broader significance of this historical moment. So there's both a sense of event in real time with the two figures, perhaps the soldiers, but clear indications that this event occurs out of time. It has cosmic, if you like, ramifications. The halo, the gold, and the transparency of the material signify something about divinity and eternity. The four crosses that you see, the small four crosses, two above the crossbar and two below, are also interpreted by some scholars as a reference to the four Gospels. So again, this idea of this duality, both documenting of facts of the life of Christ in the Gospels, but also attesting to the broader history of salvation. So I use these two images to begin to point to this fact that although the death of Jesus was horrific, that horror was not a primary focus in the early church when the crucifixion began to be recalled in imagery, or at least another focus enabled the grief to be transformed, if you like. In what follows, I want to examine some of the ways that this tension I've set out between historical event and abstract idea was tackled with what I think is quite radical creativity in the earliest Christian art. And I want to suggest that our own meditation on the cross might be helpfully enriched by returning to the early Christian context. And so to that end, let me begin with something of the social context in which Paul conducted his mission and in which Christianity developed. From the beginning, the remembrance of Jesus' death and the recognition of his glory were two sides of one coin, if you like. As he traveled across the Mediterranean around the mid-30s to the mid-50s, Paul preached Christ crucified. I'm just showing you a map here. If I was in person, I'd point out some of the routes, but you get the sense of the idea of the great expanse Paul traveled. And in his travels, preaching Christ crucified, but his presentation centered not on historical commemoration, but on the death as the final step in a divine plan for salvation. The cross displayed the power and wisdom of God, and as such, it was a symbol of redemption. In this way, the crucifixion was taken out of its historical context and interpreted with the resurrection, so these two events being inseparable. How hard was it for Paul to convey this notion to his audiences? Something I often think about. On his journey to Rome, Paul stopped for 7 days in a town called Puteoli, which you see marked here on this map of Italy, now modern Pozzuoli, located on the Bay of Naples. This is mentioned in Acts 28, verses 13 and 14. Puteoli was the commercial heart of Italy for over 300 years and one of the busiest centres of trade and business activity in the ancient Roman world. Like many other Roman towns, crucifixion was part of the political and social landscape at Puteoli. The practice of crucifixion there was codified by law in the first centuries BC and AD, and advertisements even announced public crucifixions. So at the time of Paul's visit to Puteoli, we know that the memory of Jesus' crucifixion was not only fresh, but from legal documents, from literary, archaeological, and epigraphic evidence, we know that crucifixion was a reality and a particular fear for those who were slaves. This context marks the challenge of preaching the cross as a symbol of glory. And a snapshot of this gruesome reality is further provided in the form of graffiti from Puteoli. In the early 2nd century, so only a few decades after Paul's stay in Puteoli, a visitor to this guest house in Puteoli, and I'm showing you the interior of one of the rooms, a visitor to this guest house left a more vivid testimony of the reality of crucifixion in this region. On the wall, if you imagine, the photographs are taken from the doorway. So if imagine we're entering the door there. On the wall on the left, alongside a variety of other images scratched onto the walls, our visitor drew this detailed image of a crucified person. There's no indication that it's Jesus, but it's a clear snapshot of what someone perhaps imagined or saw as a crucified person. Given what we know about the practice of crucifixion in this region in the 1st century, it is possible that the image preserves an eyewitness account of a death. And what makes this particular eyewitness account so important historically, it is the only image of a crucifixion that is not of Jesus to survive from antiquity. So we don't otherwise have any visual records or documentations from the Roman world of crucifixion, even though we know that crucifixion was widely practiced by the Romans. While public monuments happily depict execution of Rome's enemies in a variety of ways, so from beheading or burning alive to beating, Romans seem to have been loath to publicly proclaim their use of crucifixion, a death that many classical writers mention as so horrific that suicide was considered to be a preferable form of death than being executed in this way. So in this social reality that I wanted to flesh out here with this example of graffiti, Paul's efforts to preach the cross as a symbol of redemption are all the more radical, I think. He himself tells us how crazy his ideas seemed to the Romans, that as part of his mission, he encountered pushback among Jews and Gentiles against the idea of a crucified deity. You'll remember this. To the Jews, it was a stumbling block. To the Gentiles, the notion was simply ridiculous. With so many gods to choose from in an ancient world plagued by the unseen assault of demons and other physical and spiritual dangers, why would you believe in a God who had his own son publicly executed in one of the most violent and shameful ways known to Roman society? The foolishness of this notion is glimpsed in a slightly later graffito, probably executed by a slave in Rome. And in this image, perhaps some of you have seen this, a man named in the Greek inscription as Alexamenos is shown throwing a kiss, which was a standard sort of form of acclamation in the Roman world, to a figure who is crucified, but this figure has the head of a donkey. The inscription in Greek reads, Alexamenos worships his God. Is this figure then meant to be a parody of both Alexamenos' faith as well as a parody of his God? Where the former image I showed you documents something of the tortured reality of a body, here the point of this image is unquestionably, in my mind, ridicule. Graffiti was often used to make fun of individual people or beliefs, and here the author follows a standard contemporary technique adopted in public, on stage and theatrical performance, as well as in public spaces and in graffiti, for the purpose of ridicule or making fun of someone. And this technique was applying animal features. And here you see those of the donkey, maybe a horse. The application of the animal features to someone usually who was regarded as ridiculous. We have examples of this of politicians shown with the heads of a monkey, or school teachers are shown as horses. So this is a standard form of parody. Yet, of course, here the joke for Christians was the fact that God's actions were most firmly attested not in the death, but in the resurrection of Christ and the hope of eternal life that was secured for all believers. So both of these graffiti, from the early to the late 2nd century, are rare witnesses to knowledge of crucifixion as being practiced in the ancient world and to its violence. But the second graffito with the donkey head specifically witnesses to an understanding by someone looking on to Christian belief that despite the violence and shame involved in this form of execution, the image of a crucified victim was central. It was powerful for Christians. A joke, of course, is only effective if it gets to the very heart of the thing or the person being ridiculed. And a crucified deity lay at the heart of Christianity. I sketch this background of violence and ridicule because I believe that against it, in the face of it, the early Christian use of cross symbolism as a sign of God's power is all the more remarkable. And so let me now turn to just one aspect of the way that this power was specifically articulated through the adaptation, I should say, of imagery. From the outset, the cross was, of course, central to the mission of Paul, to Christian thought and exegesis, not just in relation to the death of Jesus, but specifically in relation to the power and glory of God. We know from apologists that this was not only an intellectual acknowledgement or an inner spiritual centrality, but it was also visual. That is, not only the educated among the early Christians were talking about the cross and the theological significance of the death of Jesus in the history of salvation. Ordinary believers going about their daily lives were holding fast to the cross as a meaningful symbol of God's presence and power. For example, Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, suggests that the form of the cross was essential in the world and was clearly visible. So, for example, Justin claims that ships could not sail without a cross-like mast. And you note here on this sarcophagus the strong cruciform structure of the mast on the ship on the left. And I'll show you a detail of it here. He also wrote that a person with outstretched arms shows the form of the cross with their body, that some tools in manual labor were shaped like a cross, or even anchors, which appear very frequently in Christian art. These were seen to have a cross structure at their core. And this ring is a beautiful example of this. And you see here 2 fish shown either side of the anchor flanking it. Sometimes the cross even seems to take over the design. This is another ring stone, perhaps intended to depict an anchor, the cross here placed at the center, and now seeming to sort of sprout out of the body of the fish at the base, and this symbol of the dove standing on the arm of the cross. So some scholars view this kind of imagery as disguised symbolism, that is, Christians subtly or secretly tailoring symbols from their cultural context, like the anchor, and giving them specifically Christian meaning. But I think that this reading misunderstands the inner momentum of early Christian communities. For myself, I think such adaptation of symbols like the anchor or the mast of the ship accords directly with Justin's words that Christians couldn't help themselves. They saw the cross, that is, they perceived God's presence revealed in everything from anchors to trees to people's physical gestures. They didn't, in fact, conceal it so much as delighted in demonstrating where the cross was present. And in this, the general notion of the cross as powerful as a force of good and of God's protection was essential. And it came to be interpreted more specifically. So shortly after Justin, another writer, Manichaeus Felix, makes the same points more graphically, noting that the shape of the cross was even to be found at the heart of Roman signs of victory. And by this, he meant Roman military victory trophies, the quintessential symbol of Roman dominance and power. And I'm going to show just a couple of examples of this, because this is, I think, an important connection. The Roman victory trophy was erected on the battlefield, formed out of a cut down tree that was planted, or in the trunk of it inserted in the middle of the battlefield, and the victorious Romans would hang the armor and costume of the defeated enemy on the arms of the tree, so that in this gem you see victory herself personified in the figure of this female woman with wings, Victory herself is dressing this lopped tree trunk with the arms of the defeated, such that the tree trunk almost takes on this kind of human mannequin-esque like appearance. And this is seen a little more clearly, this idea of the trophy having a human appearance on the torso of this sculpture of a Roman emperor. So he's shown wearing his armor, and the armor itself is decorated here on the breastplate. So on the most prominent part of this ceremonial clothing of the victorious emperor, we have this victory trophy right at the center, now being assembled by two figures of victory, these winged female figures who almost fly in to dress this tree trunk with the armor of the defeated. And you also note here the base is chopped off a little bit, but weaving either side of this symbol of victory are these beautiful sort of vine, flowering vine tendrils, which you might think of in connection with the cross as a tree of life. And there is a direct connection in terms of a pictorial history there of the use of Roman symbolism, different components of Roman symbolism of victory and new life and triumph, articulated in verdant growth, and of course here in this military symbolism. The Christians were bold enough to claim that the cross lay even at the heart of this trophy structure, effectively denying the supreme authority of the Roman imperial regime and claiming the superiority of the Christian God. And it's this very kind of trophy to which John Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople in the 4th century, also refers when he describes the glory of Christ's cross. And he writes, "No royal crown brings such honor to a man's head as does the cross, which was more precious than the entire world. Of old, all men shuddered at the sight of it. Now all fight to get a representation of it." So we find these representations of it everywhere. Every day, people carry around this sign formed on their foreheads as if it were a trophy on a column. This is such a powerful quotation. And we might go briefly back to that image I showed you earlier of Peter and Paul. Here, the column in between them showing the importance of the column as a place to set up something of importance. And here, of course, the initials of Christ's name, the Chi-Rho, encircled and placed above this column. Chrysostom attests to a number of important developments and practices in this passage. The cross is more precious than anything worldly. Christians fight to have a representation of it. And he notes that people carry the sign on their forehead. And of course, in this, he's referring to the gesture of making the sign of the cross. And if anything, then what we have here is a flowering of the cross as a symbol of victory. It surpasses all other worldly signs, including the crown, which in the ancient world looked something like this, a wreath often fashioned of gold or sometimes of laurel wreaths as a symbol of victory, a symbol of supreme authority and status. It was given to emperors or athletes in victory. And the cross surpassed such symbols as a sign of the utmost victory. It is a marker of Christ's or of Christian identity, of God's ownership, much like the sign used in baptism to seal the candidate or to mark them as God's. How then did this happen? How was it that these specific readings began to be mapped onto an ancient symbol in this way? After Paul's mission, as Christianity spread further across the Mediterranean in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a theology of the cross developed in apologetic literature with writers in a variety of places. I've marked out in red here just 4 towns: Carthage, Sardis, Antioch, Egypt, just to give you a sense of the extent to which writers in different locations were all witnessing to an emphasis on Christ's death on the cross, but at the same time emphasizing the salvific import of this event. The cross was seen in relation not so much to death, but to life. And this is encapsulated for me in the words of John Chrysostom, again, who writes that Jesus, before the cross, his situation was one of shame and dejection. Judas betrayed him, Peter denied him. But after he died on the cross, his situation was not destroyed, but became brighter, more glorious, and more sublime. The cross, he writes, is the sign of our salvation, of our common freedom, and of the goodness of the Lord. The ultimate pictorial expression of this came during Chrysostom's own lifetime in one of the most radical and savvy, I think, developments of imagery in early Christianity. For the representation of his death and resurrection, Christians formulated a symbol that evoked both the historical fact and the eschatological significance of the crucifixion, those 2 things that I spoke of at the outset. They encapsulated them both in this symbol without actually having to depict the crucifixion. And they did this by drawing on that symbol of the Roman trophy. So here at the center of the sarcophagus that I'm showing you, you can see this symbol. You can see either side of the central niche episodes from the Passion. On the far right, Pilate washing his hands or turning away in thought, in fact, Jesus being led to Pilate, and on the left-hand side, Simon of Cyrene on the far left carrying the cross, and Jesus being crowned with the thorns. If we go to look at the central niche in a little more detail, you see here exactly this cross at the center of the symbol. The 2 soldiers either side, one sleeping, the other looking up at the cross, taken to refer to the soldiers outside the tomb of Christ, so refer to the resurrection, while the cross itself refers to the crucifixion. But the cross is now crowned, if you like, with a victory wreath, enclosing the letters of the Chi-Rho that we saw on the column between the 2 apostles, Peter and Paul. But here now enclosed in the victory wreath, and the victory wreath is being presented, if you look right at the top, in the beak of an eagle, which was the symbol of the god Jupiter. So this is a very clever use of Roman imagery to show that Jupiter, who was all powerful, is the one that is now crowning with the victory wreath the cross of the resurrected Christ. And birds on the arms of the cross now pluck fruits from this wreath. And you'll see again, if you look closely, above the wings of the eagle, on the arch of his wings shown right at the top, these 2 small faces. And these in Roman art were used to personify the sun and the moon, Sol and Luna. So you have already here in this very early representation of the crucifixion and resurrection as one symbolic event, an effort to draw on Roman symbolism that was used in Roman art to convey something about cosmic, all-encompassing power, the might of the greater Jupiter, and something that was so important in the world that even the sun and the moon were present in marking its cosmic significance. And this sense of victory, while encapsulated in this one symbol of the resurrection, the crucifixion, is articulated elsewhere on that sarcophagus. You remember the scene of the crowning. This is not a representation of Christ crowned with thorns. He's here crowned by the Roman soldier with a victory wreath, and you see the leaves of the victory wreath wound to form the wreath rather than thorns, and at the center of it a jewel indicating its symbolism of triumph. To bring some of these things together, in the following century, when the scene at Golgotha itself came to be illustrated in more detail, the death and victory of Jesus was still able to be illustrated in one image, but began to be teased out in different ways. So I return us to the image we began. We still have the sun and the moon present in this image that we saw in the previous one. And we now have no crown, of course, but a different crown, the gold nimbus or halo to denote Christ's divinity. And of course, you remember this scene, whilst it's the largest on the page, is also illustrated with the resurrection. So the understanding still here in the late 5th or early 6th century that these two events must be understood as cause and effect, as one event. And of course, the pendant that I showed you, taking this a little step further and really streamlining it. We still have our cross at the center. Now, instead of the Chi-Rho or the letters or the monogram of Christ's name, Christ appears himself. And perhaps these two figures, as I alluded to at the outset, scholars debate about who they are. Perhaps their identity is difficult to pin down, because perhaps we too are to imagine ourselves that the cross, it's possible for us to have this gift of salvation, and like the thief, to be offered a place by Christ in paradise. This then is a good image to leave with you. I hope that some of this historical background has pointed to the ways that early Christians came to develop quite a complex imagery that radically reversed contemporary notions of power in the face of often brutal opposition, refashioning a military symbol of victory into one that articulated both the fact of the death of Jesus, but also to the reality of the resurrection, a reality that completely recast the path of suffering into one of victory. And as we come to Good Friday this week, we are asked to hold both of these dimensions in tension, not in isolation. The cross of Golgotha standing not only as a reminder of suffering, but of victory extended to all in the promise of salvation and eternal paradise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harley McGowan.
I'm sorry I spoke for so long.
No, that's great. It was wonderful to see all those images and have you put them in context for us. To those of you who are watching, if you have questions for Dr. Harley McGowan, please send them in using the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, Dr. Harley McGowan, I was struck by the fact that I didn't know that there were not other contemporary depictions of the crucifixions other than the Christian ones of Jesus, besides that one that you showed us. Do scholars, do you all have an idea about why that is? Why would there, since this was such a common form of punishment, why would artists not have depicted it?
The general feeling is that because it was such a horrific form of execution, the Romans didn't actually want to advertise the fact that they used it. one comparison is the fact that even literary sources, I mean, the Jewish historian Josephus speaks about the carrying out of mass crucifixions and so forth. Generally, in literary texts, there is a reluctance also to discuss it. So this isn't necessarily something that is unique to the visual realm, but also present in, the elite Romans who were literate and writing didn't want to talk about it either. So this is, an example of an empire, and you can think about contemporary examples of this as well, that more emphatic, acceptable modes of execution, beheading, for example, which is symbolically, we've seen this in recent times with ISIS, for example, using beheading in videos and so forth to demonstrate their, without wanting to use too clear-cut language, it is a clear-cut demonstration of death, whereas crucifixion was a very slow form of death and not very publicly interesting, so to speak. So we know about crucifixions that were carried out in the middle of the day in arenas where Romans would come to watch gladiatorial contests or fighting between beasts and so forth. The crucifixions were slow and not very exciting is the wrong word, but instant gratification from watching that kind of violence wasn't happening. So it wasn't, in terms of, I point that out only to say that in terms of demonstrating the power of the Roman army and of the emperor on public monuments, you wanted an image that would be more instantly recognizable as, we killed this enemy, and therefore because of that you live in a much safer environment, and so you should support the emperor. Crucifixion was just awful, and so also symbolically not necessarily the way that the Roman Empire wanted to stake its claim to authority.
That makes sense. We have a question from someone who wonders about the development of the Stations of the Cross. I know that's later than the period we've been looking at this morning, but can you speak to how those images of the crucifixion may have developed?
Yes, that is a later development, and develops in the medieval period too, in conjunction with different traditions around those involved in that process. I'm thinking of the Veil of Veronica, for example. So that's a later development that comes into play too with pilgrimage and more documentation of what is happening at the sites in Jerusalem, and the way in which liturgy and paths of pilgrimage to holy sites become choreographed, if you like. And some of the imagery, some of the iconography in different traditions draws on earlier traditions, but some emerges out of more imagination, I suppose, of certain events in that process.
And is there a different kind of theological grounding behind the Stations of the Cross depictions? You don't always get the same sense of victory in the representations of the crucifixion.
No, absolutely. That's an important point, because of course it's emerging at a time when private devotion to shifting out from monastic traditions and the encouragement of the laity to imagine themselves present and to feel the sufferings of Christ. This development of personal piety and devotion is very much providing momentum to new iconographies that really do want to slowly tease out stage by stage what is happening, so that we have in our interior landscape, if you like, a very close following of each specific stage through to the end. And this is, I think, this is an interesting question too, because I think this is the kind of dwelling or meditation on pain and suffering and the different forms that took has very much become ingrained in how we imagine the crucifixion itself, I think. Whereas I guess with some of this early material, I think it's very interesting to understand that this isn't how it began, and so that when we think about, to go back to your point that with which you started, Peter, about there not being representations of the crucifixion, people will often argue that there are not many representations of Jesus crucified in the early Christian period because there's so much shame attached to the event. But in truth, I think it has more to do with what Christians are interested in focusing on, what their primary focus is, and their focus is different from ours. So we expect to find the images with which we're familiar and with which the Stations of the Cross becomes integral in circulating, and yet this isn't what the early Christian communities need from art.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive that the earliest representations were more theologized in a sense.
Yeah, that's right. That's interesting.
But it makes sense. Can you speak about the development of the empty cross, not with the crucifix, not with Jesus on the cross, and the importance of that symbol?
Sure. I mean, that emerges first. We don't really have Jesus placed on the cross until the 5th and the 6th centuries. And so crucifixion scenes or Jesus placed on Golgotha with the cross emerging maybe in the late 4th, but certainly the early representations of that scene in the 5th century. And then not until the 6th century that we actually have surviving at least single crosses with a body of Christ, so a crucifix. So in actual fact, the plain cross, if you like, is the earliest form, and it can have many different meanings. So it can refer by the 4th century to the cross on which Jesus was crucified, but in the earlier representations, or the earlier instances in which we find that symbol, there are other meanings that might be present also. For example, the promise of the second coming, of the resurrection, of the glory of God, also used here. And this may also, I mentioned the 4 crosses on that pendant, someone saying, oh, these may indicate the 4 Gospels. It's also true that the plain cross, the repetition of it, was seen to have a potropaic, a sort of a good luck, charm-like quality, so that on clothing, for example, the repetition of cross signs in bordered embroidery, or a large plain cross at the center of your tunic that may be adorned with fruits and other things, may indicate the glory of Christ himself, or the repetition of the crosses saying something about the power of God. So in fact, this again, this conjunction of we must see the body of Christ on the cross is a later development, and the cross itself, this plain cross, may have several different meanings depending on the context in which we find it.
And as we end, I'm just curious if you can speak a little bit to the titulus, the so-called titulus, the King of the Jews, which kind of makes the connection between crucifixion and Jesus's royalty in the Passion narratives themselves. Was that ever made explicit in any of that connection, made explicit in any of these depictions that make the cross a symbol of victory?
It is. Well, even in the page from the illuminated manuscript that I showed, the titulus appears, and Christ, you might remember, is robed in a purple garment. So some people read into the inclusion of not only to clothe his body, but to use a purple robe to do so, an intentional referent there to his royal status. So the titulus is used in different ways, yes, to draw out those themes. Again, often we find, depending on where one particular theological idea is prominent versus another place.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Harley McGowan, for taking the time to be with us this morning, for helping us think through the cross and look at the earliest examples of its representation as we begin this Holy Week.
Thank you so much, Father Peter. It was a great honor to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you all for watching. Please join us for worship at 11 a.m.